I'm going to tell you about the most iconic pop-punk album in the whole history of the genre. Intuitively, we associate pop-punk with the 90s and 2000s and even beyond then. And while the genre found commercial success in that era, broadly speaking, pop-punk has been around since the 70s. In fact, it's pretty easy to argue that pop-punk is at the core of punk. The hardcore elements are actually the subvariant. Until the day I die, I will argue that the commercial success that the pop-punk bands had in the 2000s was a manifestation of the original 1970s notion of punk rock. But I will also argue that the common thread that influenced all of it is the Descendents. And we're talking about the Descendents, so we have to talk about the legendary Milo Goes to College, which, depending on who you ask, turns 40 this year. There's not a ton left to be said about this album. It's pretty much agreed that this is a certified pop-punk classic and one of the origins of the genre. But now that we've gone from the album that was about its lead singer leaving the band to go to college, to that very album turning 40, it's time to talk about it. And unlike most things that turned 40, Milo Goes to College is still as good as it was 4 decades ago. So in this video, I'm going to run down 5 reasons that Milo Goes to College is an indispensable piece of pop-punk history. I'll start off with the most basic praise for this album. It's really different in both theme and tone from its contemporaries. I've said it before, but it deserves to be repeated. The 1980s might be considered a dead decade for punk, but it's also like the most important decade. While pop culture had its fill of punk in the late 70s, the 80s were the era that defined the genre. With the potential for mainstream success seeming impossible after the 70s, local scenes were made up of rowdy young people, and they sprung up all over the place. And honestly, these scenes varied quite a bit in their presentation. But it's this era that I think really brought in the dark, heavy, and hardcore elements into punk rock. In this era, more than any other, punk was actually outlaw music, made by what law enforcement officials would refer to as actual criminals.
Of a generation of youth expressing their own rebellion in their own way, in terms that most outside their world don't understand, especially when it comes to scenes like this. This outbreak occurred April 29th in San Francisco. It was reminiscent of the roots of punk, violence for violence sake.
Punk shows were treated as like gatherings of gangsters. And the music complements that notion. But in the sea of darkness that was defining punk, the Descendents really had a whole new vibe to them. To be sure, the Descendents were an aggro, angry punk band. They just expressed it a little bit differently. Instead of belting out tunes about destroying the system or indulging in excess, the Descendents were bringing in a more intimate, personal rage into their songs. They wrote songs about relationships, social hierarchies, and general anxiety. Milo had the same amount of angry bite as its counterparts, but the subject matter was pretty different. The album's not positive in tone, but it's also not nihilistic either. Sonically, the album's very truthful to the punk rock thesis set forth by the Ramones. It's difficult to classify Milo as anything other than pure punk. Reason number 2. Milo actually fits pretty well into any punk rock record collection. Yes, Milo Goes to College may have sounded and looked differently than other punk happenings of the time, but it fits in the genre actually perfect. Before pop punk was codified as its own genre, it's hard to imagine music that drifted away from the punk sound but was still firmly considered punk. Also, many of the bands from this era grew frustrated with their status within punk and turned to new wave and heavy metal, whereas the Descendents were able to bring a new sound and new style but still remain within the parameters of punk. Being able to have a distinct vibe and still remain in your core scene is a real balancing act that very few bands have been able to accomplish over the years. Think of a very close contemporary of the Descendents like Bad Religion, who basically fell off the map in the mid-80s when they tried to make a prog album, or how Black Flag and Suicidal Tendencies have punk and metal careers, and they don't always seem to unify their respective fan bases. Luckily for the Descendents, they came out of the gate with a style and sound that was firmly punk rock, but also unique enough to stand out. Milo Goes to College didn't change the genre, it changed what could be considered within the genre. Also, I should note, the Descendents are not apolitical, even though I contrasted them to a lot of the political bands. When they do hit politics, they actually do it very, very well. Reason 3. Universal relatability. I've said it a billion times, but it bears repeating. Pop punk is appealing because it's very relatable. Not everyone can relate to pure nihilism, substance abuse, or life on tour. But I'd venture to say that more people can relate to the feelings of fondness not being reciprocated. That's pretty universal. Basic? Yes. You can even call it generic. But nobody quite hits the nail on the head the way the Descendents do. There's nothing particularly creative about a chorus that says, "Now you're gone and I'm alone." But it's delivered in such a way that brings the audience into the song. While the more conventional punk of its time may have had an appeal due to its dangerous nature, the Descendents had an accessibility that is accomplished without seemingly any compromise. Reason number 4, the two standout songs really stand out. We can debate what are the best songs on this album, but I would say the most enduring songs are Hope and Suburban Home. Two songs, strangely enough, not written by Bill Stevenson. First, let's talk about Hope. If you're someone who isn't convinced that Milo is the first capital P pop punk album, I might have some time for that argument. After all, I explicitly mentioned that the album fits neatly with its other punk counterparts. But if there's a track on this album that really feels like the origin of pop punk, it's Hope. And it's one of the few songwriting contributions of Milo Aukerman, the perfect anthem of a scorned ex-boyfriend. Milo himself, he really brings it home with the vocal performance here. Side note, I first heard this song not by the Descendents, but by Sublime, and it was like my favorite song on the album. That should have been a hint of what I was going to be into. Same goes for Bad Religion. Same album, I believe, too. With all that said, if I had to pick one Descendents song to listen to for the rest of my life, it would absolutely be Suburban Home. Musically, it's as solid as anything else the band has ever done. But lyrically, it's one of those songs that's truly up to interpretation.
I want to be stereotyped. I want to be classified.
Is he being sarcastic? Or does he think suburban life is actually lame? I think whatever your opinion is, that's going to be the opinion that you're going to have of the song. And perhaps more importantly, this song, along with several others, are actually critiques of the punk scene. These two songs perfectly exemplify the entire dynamic range that the Descendents can reach. And the final reason, the archetypes it established. As I've been kind of hinting at, this is the template for pop punk. What the hell does that actually mean? After all, I think there's like a wider gap from this to this. Well, the path from here to here might be a little more apparent. But all of it is underscored through a Milo lens. The album is a catalyst for the genre for two reasons. First off, the songs contain subject matter that would come to define the genre. Just the two songs in the last section alone that I mentioned play off of both tropes of romantic frustration and modern American anxiety. These are the two broad categories that most of the genre can fit into. It's not about destroying the system. It's about existing in the system, having a little bit of guilt for how well you do within it. It's not about being the guy that can get the girls, or even the tough, sensitive guy. It's about the guy that can't be the tough guy or the player. But instead of being melancholy, he's actually angry. It's about being critical of punk being the be-all and end-all. All of those are great pop-punk tropes. Beyond the music, Milo is the best because, well, it's Milo, and he made his debut. Punk rock's visual art is one of the great dynamics of being into the genre. And in a crowd of iconic logos, Milo stands out above them all. Milo is the avatar of pop-punk. Milo's nerdy. He's too intellectual for his surroundings. He's petulant. He's uneasy with his place in the world. He's socially conscious. He's pop-punk. And that is why Milo Goes to College is the most iconic pop-punk band of all time. What do you think of the album? Sound off down below in the comment section. Talk to you next time.